Sorry.
that I want to get out there.
Say got it.
So just a reminder that that if you're going to be involved in this, and I hope a lot of you do get involved in it, you really need to get the property owner's okay to place cameras, trail cameras on the property. So that might be state parks, county parks, perhaps your town, just to check in with them, the Peconic Land Trust or the Nature Conservancy. Or in the case of a lot of the work I do, it could be a private homeowner, and it doesn't have to be a big piece of property. It just has to be a really cool spot that makes sense where you're going to get the animal that you're targeting. In my case, it was river otters. So, you know, I've never really had a problem with that. And I think the landowners really appreciate that heads up. So the other thing is, do not place these devices on hiking or mountain biking trails. We really don't want, well, first of all, you don't want to do that because you're going to get a lot of images. People, it's going to waste up battery and SD card space. But also it doesn't look good. It's not something that you really want to do. So just a reminder of those two things. And with that, I want to introduce Janet Pesataro, who's one of the most phenomenal wildlife trail cam people I've ever met. I think she's like getting up there in the national scene with her work, and really has documented some amazing behaviors. And it's a great resource, and I'm really excited that she's willing to give us some time to go over this. I'm really looking forward to it. I can learn a lot from her, and Janet is also, I've been out in the field with Janet several times, and she's a really good field biologist. She's excellent in reading wildlife tracking signs. So I think you'll be really happy with this presentation, and this will be recorded, so you can always send this out to any friends or colleagues to share. You know, probably we'll have that out in a day or two. We'll have that link we'll send to everybody. So thank you all for your interest in doing this. I hope that there are a number of teachers out there. I think this project and using the trail cams, even in the schoolyard areas, could be a great learning experience for kids. Without further ado, Janet, I'm going to let you take it over.
Okay, thank you for that very flattering introduction. So let's get started. This is an outline of what we're going to cover: trail camera basics, how to set up, smart camera placement, and some examples of specific interest to Long Island Mammal Survey. And I'll wrap it up with a little bit about the use of lures and baits. So for those who are unfamiliar with trail cameras, what they are is rugged weatherproof cameras that can be left outside for long periods of time in all kinds of weather. And they have a sensor that detects animals, and detection causes the camera to trigger to take a photo or a video, depending on how you have it set. The kind of sensor that they have is called a passive infrared sensor, which we usually call a PIR sensor, and it detects objects if both of these are true. If the object is a different temperature from its surroundings, and if the object moves through a detection zone, which we'll talk about in a bit. So here's one with everything labeled. The PIR sensor looks like this up at the top. These little LEDs are the flashes, and there's a camera lens, obviously. And a trail camera has a computer embedded in it that does all the fancy stuff. There's a battery compartment, a slot to put your memory card in. And for those cameras that record video, which most of them do, most will also record audio and have a microphone. So when you're going to buy a trail camera, there are a lot of things to consider. And some of these items might be more or less important to you specifically. But I'm only going to talk about the ones in yellow here because they are the ones that I think are most important for success for the kind of survey you're going to be doing, a presence-absence survey. A good resource for you would be this website down at the bottom left called trailcampro.com. they not only sell trail cameras, but they have really detailed quantitative reviews of many trail camera models so that you can compare and contrast. So one thing to consider that will be important for your purposes is the type of flash that it has. And there are a few different options, but I think if you want to document as many species as possible for the kind of survey you're going to be doing, it would be best to get one that has what we call a no-glow infrared flash. So no glow means that the animals generally cannot see it. It's invisible to people and probably invisible or mostly invisible to most mammals. So that's the least noticeable one. It's not likely to scare any animals. The downside is that with an infrared flash, you just get black and white images at night like this one here. For a slightly better night photo image resolution, you can go with a red glow infrared, but that does have some visible light in it. The animals that tend to be most spooked by that are the canids, particularly coyotes, since they're a species of interest for you. It's probably best to go with the no glow infrared. And then, of course, there are white flash cameras that give you color photos at night, but they would also be likely to spook away, particularly the canids. Trigger speed is also an important consideration, and that is more accurately called a trigger delay. Because what that is it's the amount of time that elapses between the moment the camera detects an animal and the moment it takes a photo. So there's a little bit of a delay. It detects, and then it tells the camera to take a photo. In the old days, the trigger delay could be a few seconds with the old cameras. These days, the delay is super short. And there are a number of models that have a trigger delay for photos of less than 1/4 of a second and for videos less than 1/2 a second. And that's about what you should look for. You should look for something that's with those short trigger delays. And the problem with a long trigger delay is that by the time the image is taken, the animal could be out of the frame completely, out of the camera's field of view. For example, in this photo here, these are mountain lions, and there's one here. The one that actually triggered the camera was this one on the right, and all we got is the tail and the hind leg there. Sometimes if the trigger delay is really long, it's a really slow camera, you miss the animal entirely. So you want to document as many species as possible, so you are concerned about the trigger delay. You want that to be short. Another thing that's important is what we call the detection zone pattern. It turns out that different camera models have different PIR sensors, and each type of PIR sensor has its own detection zone pattern. Unfortunately, this information is not available for most trail camera models. Most of the manufacturers do not put it in the instruction booklets, although Reconyx does. I happen to know what a few of the detection zone patterns are for a few models because Robert Zach, who is a retired electrical engineer and also my husband, is really interested in trail camera technology, and he has very carefully worked out the detection zone patterns for several different models. And you can see all his work detailed as to how he did this at this link here, which is on our blog, Winterberry Wildlife. But I'm going to explain to you what they are and how they work, because it will help you understand why trail cameras miss a lot of animals, and how it'll give you some insight as to how to better position your cameras to maximize the chances of capturing the animals. Okay, so we are looking at this Browning Elite HP5. The photo here indicates the camera's field of view, and each red-green block is a detection zone. So there are 3 detection zones for this camera, okay? And the way it works is that an animal has to pass through at least one of these zones in order to be detected. It does not have to pass through all of them. And it's not that black and white of a situation, though, because the way it works is that when the animal gives the greatest signal when it's crossing from red to green or green to red. So it will very likely be detected if it crosses that line between red and green. It might be detected if it passes only through the red portion or only through the green portion. Okay, so you get a sense of how kind of flaky these things are. And one thing you notice, well, you notice a few things about this pattern. One is that there's a lot of area within the camera's field of view that does not overlap with any detection zone. Okay, all this area does not overlap. That's all dead area. That's dead zone, okay? So if an animal passes through the dead zone and does not intersect with a detection zone, it will not be detected. So you can imagine like an animal swimming in this pond, like directly away from the camera or directly towards this camera between these two zones, that won't be detected. Or a bird flying at the very top of the field of view, that won't be detected either. So you see why they miss some. Another thing you notice about this particular pattern is that a big part of two of the zones, the one on the far left and the one on the far right, lie outside the camera's field of view. Okay, and this is actually a really clever strategy for reducing the trigger delay, and I'll explain why. So look at my cursor at the far left of the screen, and let's pretend that's an animal walking towards the camera field of view. When it gets to the red, it might be detected. When it crosses into the green, it very likely will be detected. But then there's a little bit of a trigger delay, so it's probably not going to be photographed until it enters the field of view. And it'll probably be photographed right as it enters the field of view, which is good. You want that to happen. If we didn't have the right and the left zone, we only had the one in the middle, the animal would have to be right in the middle before it's even detected. Okay, hopefully that was clear enough. So here's another example of one. The blue is the camera's field of view, and these 5 red-green blocks are detection zones. And one thing you notice about this is that all of these zones are in the upper half of the camera's field of view. We thought this was a little odd, and Bob's thought when he worked this out was that maybe this camera was defective and they put the PIR sensor in upside down, because wouldn't you want your detection zones in the foreground, in the lower half of the field of view? But then he checked another one, stealth cam, and we had a very similar pattern, that all of the detection zones were in the upper half of the camera field of view. And then we got to thinking, well, who buys most trail cameras? And the answer to that is hunters buy the vast majority of trail cameras. And they are most interested in large game species like deer and moose and elk. Those are all big animals that are likely gonna be detected. They're likely gonna intersect with one of these zones when they pass in front of the camera. So this is adequate for hunters. And moreover, it might actually be great for hunters because with the detection zones all in the upper half, the camera is not going to trigger for all the mice and squirrels that run around in the foreground. And that's a good thing because nobody wants to fill up, most people don't want to fill up their SD card and waste their battery on squirrels and mice running around. But for you, this would be a bad pattern because you are interested in documenting some of the smaller animals like weasels and mink, and you may miss a lot of them with a camera like this. So based on what we've talked about so far, I'm going to recommend this particular model. It's not, obviously there are other ones that would be sufficient for your purposes, but this is one that I know about. I know well, I have several of them, and I know what the detection zone pattern is, and I know that it would satisfy your needs. It has a no glow IR flash. It's very fast. Trigger speed is really good. And the detection zone pattern is pretty good for your purposes. And the other thing about it is it has a really intuitive user interface, which is important if you're new to trail cameras or if you're just not a gadget person. So this one I think would be really good. There may be, many others out there that that I'm not familiar with. So we'll leave it at that. So once you get your camera, you have to choose some batteries. Most of them take AA batteries, and if they take AA's, you will have 3 or 4 options. For anything that takes AA's, you'll be able to use lithium batteries like Energizer Ultimate Lithium, alkaline batteries, or rechargeable lithium ion batteries, and you might be able to use rechargeable nickel metal hydrides. but not all trail cameras are compatible with those. So if you want to use those, you have to make sure the camera you purchase can take them. For your purposes, if you are the type of person who's going to be checking your camera every few weeks, you can go with any of these options. We use Energizer Ultimate Lithium a lot because we leave cameras in place for months and sometimes even a year without checking them. So we want super long lasting batteries, but it's totally unnecessary. If you're going to check your camera every few weeks, you can replace the batteries as needed if you want to use alkaline or whatever. If you do go with Energizer Ultimate Lithium, I strongly recommend that you buy the ones in the sealed plastic packaging. You can buy them in bulk in these cardboard boxes, but we know of several people who have found dead or partially drained ones in these. I think that these cardboard boxes, it's much cheaper, but they're not secure, and it's easy for people to put in dead ones or counterfeits in those. And, you know, I know this is true for Energizer Ultimate Lithium. It may be true for other kinds of batteries too. So just think about that if you are considering buying them in bulk. You're going to need some kind of memory card for your trail camera. Most of them use a standard SD card like this one. And if you look really closely at this little red circle, in there is a little gray line. That's a switch on the SD card. It has a locked position and an unlocked position. You need to unlock it before you put in the camera, because if it's locked, it's not going to record photos and videos. The other thing you should do is before putting it in the camera, you need to format it in your computer. That will get rid of any bugs that are in there, computer bugs. And then when you put it in the camera, you should format it again. On the camera menu, the option will be to format, delete, or erase. They all mean the same thing. They all do the same thing. They all erase everything that's on the card, so you need to have saved that to your computer if there's anything on it you want. And they all format it, which means it makes the software on the card compatible with the software in the camera. Okay. I feel like I left something out there, but I can't remember. Maybe it'll come to me. Okay, so each camera has its own unique user interface and different options and different bells and whistles. I strongly recommend that before you put it outside somewhere and leave it for a long period of time, that you fiddle around with it, read the instruction booklet, and understand really well how it works, and make sure you have it set to do what you think it should be doing. So test it in your house, test it in daylight, test it in darkness, walk in front of it in daylight and in darkness. In darkness, I just bring it down to my dark basement and test it there before you leave it anywhere for a long period of time. Because if you don't test your camera and then you come back 2 months later and find out it was defective, you've just wasted all that time. So I test every single one that I buy. The cameras usually come with either a fabric strap like this at the bottom that where my cursor is, or a bungee cord, and you thread either one through the back of the camera and you attach it to a tree, or in this case, I put it on a stump. You need to make sure that whatever you attach it to is sturdy and steady. You don't want something that's going to sway around in the wind, because what could happen is that if that PIR sensor detects relative motion between the camera and the vegetation, it may trigger whenever the vegetation moves, which could be nearly constantly. And the reason that happens is that the vegetation probably absorbs some of the warmth from the sunlight and becomes a little bit warmer than the air temperature around it. So when the wind blows, the camera just sees moving warm bodies. So it doesn't know it's not an animal. So it will trigger. And oh, I should mention, think carefully about your target species. I know you want to document as many species as possible, but you're going to have to generally prioritize large or small animals with each set. So for example, I had this camera really down low, as you can see, and that's because I was interested in beavers and otters hauling in at the edge of this pond, and they're not very tall, right? But let's say I was interested in moose. I would have put this camera much higher up and much further back from my focal point, because I would want to make sure the whole moose fits in the photo. So you kind of need to prioritize that way, big or small. So I know you don't have moose in Long Island, but I'm just using this photo to make a point. So I put this camera out and did not return to trim the vegetation during the growing season. So it kept growing while I wasn't there. I got some nice moose pictures, but then I got 30,000 photos of this leaf moving. This alder bush next to the camera grew, and I didn't go trim it. So it filled up my SD card completely, and I got no more animal pictures. So do make sure you trim the vegetation, and if it's during the growing season, you'll have to go back periodically. So depending on where you put your camera, you might be concerned about theft or vandalism. And if you are, you could get what we call a security box for your trail camera. They only make them for the more expensive ones, like probably more than $150. Cheaper cameras, to my knowledge, I've never seen one made for the cheaper cameras. To find them, you can go to camlockbox.com or trailcampro.com. And as I mentioned before, trail cameras come in, we saw pictures of different trail cameras. They come in different shapes and sizes. So you have to get one that's made specifically for your model so that it'll fit properly. So there are these two-piece metal boxes. And on the upper right here, this is the back of the box, and you see all these little holes in it. That's so that you can bolt it to a tree if you want to attach it in that manner. So that's what I did in this photo beneath here. It's bolted to the tree, put the camera inside, slip the front on, and then I put a padlock through the bottom hole there. And that's pretty secure. Another way to do it is to use, instead of bolting it to the tree, or in addition to bolting it to a tree, you can get what's called a Python cable lock. That's what this cable is there. You can buy those for maybe around $15 or $20 at Home Depot or Lowe's or from Amazon. And you thread it through the back of the box, wrap it around the tree, lock it that way. You can, for additional security, you can also put a padlock through the bottom hole here. And this is pretty secure. Nothing is theft proof. A motivated thief can cut cables and pick locks, but they have to be really motivated. Most thieves I've found are casual, and they will take cameras if they are easy to take, but it's not common for them to come back and put the work into stealing something secured like this. Okay, I'm just going to give you a few tips on improving your results. A common place to put a trail camera is on an animal trail. And if you do that, one thing you should not do is put the camera on the trail looking directly down the trail. Because these PIR sensors are really bad at picking up animals that are walking directly towards the camera or directly away from the camera. Part of that probably has to do with the detection zone patterns that we talked about before, but there may be other reasons too. It's really complicated technology, and I don't claim to understand it all by any stretch of the imagination. So a good way to do it is you pull your camera off to the side and either angle it into the animal trail or face it in perpendicular to the trail. And here's an example of a photo. This was with a DSLR camera trap, not a regular trail camera. You can see this trail here. It goes between two ponds. Otters and beavers use it a lot. And I pulled the camera off to the side, angled it in to get this nice perspective of the otter. And in this case here, I was interested in animals running back and forth on this log. So I just aimed it in perpendicular to the log, and that worked out fine there. Another thing to consider is it's a good idea to try to face your camera approximately to the north, so that at no point during the day will the sunlight be shining directly into the camera. Because again, because of that PIR sensor detecting warmth and movement, sunlight shining into it could make the camera trigger constantly while the sunlight's shining into it. So if you face it to the north, there'll never be a time of day when that happens. This is really important in open areas, less important in shady forests. Okay, so we're going to move on to material that's much more interesting to me personally, and that is smart camera placement. How you decide where to put it to either get just a lot of general activity or to target specific species. So when I go to a new area that I'm familiar with, I start by looking at topo maps and aerial imagery. And I look for places on the maps that I think are likely hotspots or probable hotspots for the species that I'm interested in. And then I drop waypoints on those maps, and I go up with my GPS and I hike out to those areas, And then I look for whatever habitat I'm most interested in. I might want a forested area with lots of logs, or I might be interested in, an open field or a shrubby area, depending on the species. And then the next level that you can do is to look for animal sign, tracks, scat, and feeding sign. Now, living on Long Island, you might know the area like the back of your hand. You might not need to look at maps. You probably already have some ideas of where you'd like to put cameras. And you can go a long way just by putting it in the right habitat. You don't need to, become an expert tracker to be successful with trail cameras. You don't need to do any tracking. But if you want to go that extra level and really increase the chances of getting a lot of interesting activity or to target specific species, then you go to this level and you learn something about tracking. So, for example, on looking at maps and aerial imagery like Google Earth, the kinds of things you would look for would be, find the human trails, right? I mean, you're not going to be putting your cameras on human trails, but animals, the larger animals do use them, and you'll get a sense of how they move because they use those. And you might look for what we call pinch points. A pinch point is an area that tends to force animal travel down a certain pathway. So, for example, a strip of land between ponds. And up at this aerial image here, you can see there's this big pond here, a little one here, and there's this little strip of land. The animals have to go, they have to travel that way because the animals that don't want to swim or walk through the swamp, they have to move that way. So I know that this is going to be a high travel area. And that's exactly where this bobcat was photographed, and many other species as well. Okay, so that's the type of thing you look for. If you're in a mountainous habitat, you look for other things, saddles, passes, notches, and so forth. But that's probably not relevant to your area. And you can see, of course, on the maps, you see all kinds of water sources. And again, if you're in a mountainous habitat, you can look for overlooks and vantage points, probably not relevant to you. Then when you're out on the ground and you're looking for habitat elements, the kind of things that you're going to look for are animal trails. You can't see that. You can see human trails on the topo maps usually, but not the animal trails. So you look for animal trails. You could look for logs spanning streams that animals might use as bridges. Breaks in stone walls and in fences. Animals tend to move through them, and that's where this coyote was photographed here. The camera's targeting this little opening in that stone wall. And then you can look for the kinds of things that could be dens or shelters for wildlife. So like hollow logs, jumbles of logs or boulders, large trees with lots of cavities in them tend to be full of wildlife because rodents and birds will nest in them, and then predators go and hunt them. And in the suburbs, if you don't have those options, spaces under porches and sheds can attract a lot of animals. Concentrated food sources in the wild, like blueberry bushes, raspberry bushes, in the suburbs or in your backyard, compost piles and bird feeders can actually attract a lot of wildlife. And then with your on-the-ground search, you can find water sources that are too small to be seen on topo maps and aerial imageries, like vernal pools. And you can look for smaller scale overlooks and vantage points that you don't see on the maps, like maybe a big boulder that a fox or a coyote might get on top of to look around. So that's what you look for, and you have some examples of what you look for in your on-the-ground habitat search. And if you want to go to the next level, you can look for animal sign, tracks, and scat, and feeding sign. And so like some of those potential dens and shelters that you identified when you're doing your habitat search, you can start looking for animal sign to see if there's any evidence that an animal has used it recently. And this photo here sort of exemplifies that three-step process, and I'll explain it. So this was in Arizona, and this camera is actually along a stream bed. And we identified this stream bed on topo maps, dropped a waypoint, hiked out. And when we got to the stream bed, we noticed that there was an animal trail along it. So I thought, great, this is where the camera's going, somewhere along this trail, because I know that animals are using that area. But I didn't want to just put it anywhere along the trail. I wanted to find something of interest that might attract a little bit more activity. And I noticed that under this boulder, there was a ground burrow, a ground squirrel-sized ground burrow. and it looked active. It looked like there was a lot of fresh activity there. So I thought, great, so I'll get some ground squirrel activity and maybe some predators coming by that might be thinking about hunting that ground squirrel. And indeed, we got this fox who was super interested in that ground squirrel. Okay, so before we go on to specific species examples, I just want to give you a crash course in scat identification, which I actually find scat much more helpful than tracks when I place cameras, because we only have tracks. We don't have snow that much in Massachusetts. I'm sure you don't in Long Island either, and there's not good sand or soil substrate everywhere, so you don't often see good tracks. So scat's super helpful. And I just want to make a really brief point about it, not asking you to memorize all of these, but all of these animals, the vole, the rabbit, the moose, the flying squirrel, and the deer, they are all plant eaters. They're all herbivores, and they all poop out pellets. Most herbivores poop out pellets. So if you see piles of pellets, you think plant-eating animal, and the size of the pellet will help you narrow down what the species is, okay? And with carnivores, or in some cases omnivores, their scat tends to be tubular. So they generally don't produce piles of pellets. So here we have a bobcat, the coyote, an otter, weasel, and fox. They don't always produce tubular scats. It depends on what they're eating, but when you see tubular scats like this, you don't think herbivore, you think carnivore, okay? And then again, the size, particularly the diameter of the tubular scat, helps you narrow down to species, to a few species usually. So that's just a super basic rule rather than memorizing every individual animal. That's something to start with if you're not familiar with tracking. Okay, so we are going to talk about a few different species. How would you target them? Weasels, mink, gray fox, coyote, and flying squirrel. So on Long Island, you have presumably two species of weasel, the long tail and the short tail, but we are going to talk about them as if they're the same because they're very similar habits and you're not going to be able to ID one versus the other based on your trail cam photos alone. They are tiny, long, skinny carnivores that eat rodents, rabbits, birds, bird eggs, and so forth. They have an interesting scent marking habit of leaving their scats on logs, stumps, and rocks. They like elevated surfaces for their poops. And just knowing this, you don't need to know everything about weasels. Just knowing this, you can come up with some good ideas for camera placement. Rodent holes. Long, skinny animals are really good at sneaking down rodent holes and eating the occupants. You might find them near rabbit runs, basically anywhere that you find a high density of sign of small prey animals, you could potentially get a weasel there. Cavity-ridden trees, a big old tree with lots of cavities, that's full of birds and mice and maybe flying squirrels. Weasels like to hunt there too. They sneak right into those cavities. They might patrol compost piles because compost piles attract mice and voles and sometimes rats, depending on where you are. And of course, they'll patrol around chicken coops trying to find ways to get in. And they like to hunt around piles of logs, firewood, or brush because rodents hide in those, under those. And also between the rocks in stone walls, chipmunks and mice hide in there, so weasels will go hunt in there. And if you are lucky enough to find a stump or a log with weasel scats on it, by all means target it to confirm presence of weasel, because if you see more than one scat there, they're likely to come back. I'm not going to go into detail on the tracks. I think if you're new to tracking, the thing to do is don't worry so much about foot morphology and all that fancy stuff that advanced trackers like to talk about. Just get a sense of the overall track size of the species and first learn the track pattern, the pattern that the animal typically leaves as it moves along. So weasels often produce a pattern that we call a 2-2 loping pattern, and it's these slanted pairs of tiny tracks. So when you see that, you think weasel. Here's another example here, slanted pair of tiny tracks. Just knowing that will help you a lot. They don't always use that trail pattern, but this is a common one. And their scats, it would be great if you learn to ID their scats. They are tiny, tapered, and twisted. See, there are 4 examples here. All of these are inches on the ruler, teeny little scats. These ones are all full of fur, and they're all twisted up. And you see these long tapered ends. These are classic weasel scats. And that's exactly how I got this photo here. This one's with a DSLR camera trap. This log, this is a moss-covered log. It had 5 or 6 or 7 weasel scats on it. So we simply just set up the camera, targeted the log, and lo and behold, the weasel showed up. When you find something like that, a number of scats from one species, you have found an important spot for that species, and it makes a great target for a camera. Targeting ground burrows. This is on the left here. It's not a great picture of a weasel, but it's good enough that you can tell it's a weasel. That weasel's about to go into a groundhog burrow. This big mound here is the mound of excavated soil that the groundhogs throw out as they dig their burrow. Here's a better photo so you can see what a groundhog burrow looks like. I think you have a pretty good population of groundhogs on Long Island. So if you find a place, yeah, you do. I see people nodding. If you find a place where there's a lot of groundhogs, set cameras up at some of the burrows, and you might find a weasel or other predators snooping around them. Sometimes you find the larger predators like foxes around them, but they're not as good at hunting in ground burrows. Weasels are designed extraordinarily well to sneak down ground burrows. So yeah, the groundhog burrow is, the hole is like 4, 5, or 6 inches in diameter. And this big throw mound here was like, I don't know, 2.5 or 3 feet in diameter. So that's how you would ID that. Just to drive home that point that weasels like to hunt in ground burrows, this was actually in Nevada. I was most interested on this little rodent on the right here. That's called a kangaroo rat. There are lots of them in the West. We don't have them in the East, but they're super cute. And so this little kangaroo rat is about to go into his burrow. And I got lots of footage of them. And then I was lucky enough to get this beautiful weasel who came looking for a kangaroo rat dinner. Okay, skinny little predator that can fit right down those burrows. You don't have kangaroo rats, but I think you do have chipmunks. This is something you could probably do in your backyard. If you have a bunch of chipmunk burrows, you could target a few of them and see if you get a weasel. I've only targeted 1 chipmunk burrow, and I did not get a weasel at it, but that would be sort of a cool thing to try. And their burrow holes are like about 1.5 inches in diameter, and there's no big throw mound around them. It's just kind of flat and trampled out around those holes. So that's what they look like. This is a really interesting one. It's a little fancy. I was targeting a ruffed grouse drumming log. If you're not familiar with grouse, they are chicken-like birds. And in the springtime, the males choose a log, usually in dense cover, like you see here, where they come to do their territorial and courtship display over and over again, day after day during the breeding season. So they're there making noise. So that means the predators learn that they're there, and they will patrol these logs like this weasel did. So he's snooping around. I think right now he's really just looking at the camera. He's curious about that. But I've only put, I've put trail cameras at 2 different grouse logs and got weasels at both. So this is potentially a good place to get weasel. I think we're going to see the grouse in a few seconds here. I do describe, we don't have time to go into how to find a grouse log, but I do describe that in my book. I have a little chapter on grouse if you're interested in this. And you get the advantage of getting all this cool footage of the grouse doing the display. That's what the display looks like. So just a fun thing, you know, that's kind of like advanced Long Island Mammal Survey would be doing something like that. This is a simpler thing. In this case, I targeted the compost bin in my backyard. And here's a weasel sneaking between the slow motion of the weasel. And of course, the weasel was there because he was hoping to find, this is a mouse here, that's weasel food. He was hoping to find mice or voles, and there's a possum. Actually, so compost in the backyard is a really easy way to to document a bunch of different species likely. So if that's what your options are, if you don't have a lot of wilderness around you, this could be super productive. Okay, the mink is in the weasel family. It looks a lot like a weasel, has that long skinny build with short legs, but they're much bigger, around 2 pounds-ish. And they are, a lot of their habits are similar to the smaller weasels, but they are more aquatic. They're more associated with water. And while they do eat mammals and birds, they also eat a lot of fish and crayfish and frogs and so forth. Close to water is where you want to look for these. Presumably they have a similar scent marking habit to the smaller weasels in that they leave their scats on logs and stumps, but near water. So you're going to look near water for these. And they are super attracted to logs and holes near water. So I've had the most luck getting them at logs spanning streams. They run across them like bridges. And also logs paralleling the water's edge. They also like hollow logs near water. They might take shelter in those. Holes under roots of trees and shrubs right in the bank of a stream or a pond. They'll use those for shelter too. So you could target something like that. And if you can find, again, like the other weasels, if you can find a log or something with probable mink scats on it, you could target that. So for their tracks are very much like the smaller weasels, but they're much bigger. So get a sense of the overall size. Don't worry about the foot morphology if you're a beginner, and just familiarize yourself with the common trail pattern it produces. Again, that tutu lope is a common one in snow. Here's what it looks like in deeper snow. And you notice this little trough back here in the snow. That's because mink sometimes slide downhill and they'll just produce a trough instead of separate tracks. I don't have a photo of confirmed mink scats, so here's another weasel scat for you. If a mink scat would be a little bigger than this, probably more like 3/8 inch in diameter as opposed to a 1/4 inch, which that is approximately. It will be full of fur if they've been eating mammals, but remember that minks also eat crayfish and fish and other things. So it might have crayfish parts in it or something else. This one here, this is a log that's paralleling a big beaver pond, and I've gotten many captures of mink running back and forth on this log. This is a cool one here. This is a log spanning a stream, and this one happened to get a lot of both mink and smaller weasel captures. So I'm going to play this video for you, and you can see. So that's mink. Another mink capture. Another mink. Another mink. This raccoon is scent marking by rubbing his anus on the log. That's very common raccoon behavior. Another mink capture. You see, that's one of the smaller weasels. Now you see how much bigger the mink is. Teeny little weasels. So that gives you a sense of the size comparison too. So this log happened to be productive for both mink and the smaller weasels, but generally I find that mink use them more than weasels. This is a hole. It's at the edge of a pond and it's right at the base of this tree. I've been looking at this hole forever, for like a few years, and thinking about putting a camera at it to see what goes in there. Hopefully mink. We just put one up there a few weeks ago and haven't checked it yet. So I can't wait to see what, if anything, we get there. But you want to look for a hole that's maybe, I don't know, like 2 to 4 inches in diameter. You don't want to put it, you wouldn't find mink at a hole that's much bigger than that. Animals like to choose a hole that they can just fit into, because if it's got too much extra space, then bigger predators can get in there. So they want to choose a hole that's about the diameter of their own body. Okay, the gray fox. The gray fox is evolved as a carnivore, but it currently functions as an omnivore. So in addition to rodents and rabbits and birds and all that, it also eats a lot of fruits and nuts and grains and insects. It's very omnivorous. It eats almost anything. And it too has a scent marking habit of putting its scats on elevated surfaces, but it also likes to put it on visually prominent objects, which I will show you some of the examples of in a minute. And they sometimes create latrines, which are very useful to you if you find one, and we'll see an example of that. I think of the gray fox as an animal of edges and ledges. What I mean by that is brush and rocks. So they're not likely to be out in the middle of a meadow or deep in the forest interior. They like the brushy edges between field and forest, or any brushy area or rocky areas. And every single fox capture I've gotten in any part of the country has been in either rocky or brushy or rocky brushy areas, okay? They do use trails, so you could try putting it on an animal trail. And again, they're gonna be attracted to the areas that have a high density of sign of their favorite prey, rabbits, rodents, and they will scavenge from carcasses. And maybe you might find them near fruit trees and berry bushes. They'll eat the fruit themselves and maybe hunt the other animals that come to eat, the littler animals that come to eat the fruit. And they might come to bird feeders, maybe even picking up some of the spilled seed, or at least hunting the other animals that come to pick up the spilled seed. And they'll lurk around chicken coops and compost piles for the rodents, and maybe even the fruit scraps you throw out there. And they are in the dog family, so they have little doggy-like tracks, about 1.5 inches in diameter, typically very round, maybe slightly oval. And their common movement pattern is an alternating walk or trot. And it usually has, if you find them in a walking pattern, it usually has a noticeable zigzag to it. Hopefully some of you have dogs and you know what I'm talking about here when I say alternating walks and trots. And scat placement, I mentioned that they will put their scats on elevated surfaces like stumps and logs and so forth, but they really love to drop them on some kind of prominent object. Here's a classic one here on this lid on a more natural setting. This was in the suburbs. In a more natural setting, they might like drop it on a white mushroom, you know, something that stands out. And this one's on an old glove. And the scat appearance and contents obviously depends on what the animal has been eating. So you're going to find fruit and insect remains in gray fox scats too. And they, as I mentioned, they create latrines. This is a latrine where in the top photo here is it's a bunch of fox scats on a huge boulder, and this was actually in Nevada. And I was so excited when I found this. I wasn't certain it was a fox latrine, but I figured I'd put the camera there, and lo and behold, I got him doing the dirty deed. And many other captures of the fox too. He wasn't only just pooping. When an animal makes a latrine like this, it means it's probably a very important core area for the animal. So this fox probably had a den between the rocks somewhere in there, which I never identified, but it certainly was spending a lot of time in this area. And once again, here's where I got this fox by targeting a prey animal. And this is it. This is it's a species of squirrels they have in Arizona called the rock squirrel, and it lives in ground burrows, and that was its burrow. Here's another example of getting a predator by targeting its prey species. This photo on the left, this is a trail cam photo, and this cactus here at the far left, that's the same one as in this other photo. And once again, this is in Nevada. This cactus here was interesting because it had all this feeding sign on it. You can kind of see that some of it's been gnawed away. And then there's this huge collection of pellets, scat pellets, which are rabbit pellets. And I know that no rabbit could ever poop out all that scat in one sitting. So I could tell by looking at this that this rabbit was coming back and forth here very frequently, eating the cactus and pooping. And so that's why I put the camera there and got plenty of footage of the rabbit and a lot of footage of this fox hanging around there too, probably hoping for a rabbit dinner. Gray foxes, like so many other predators, are perfectly happy to scavenge. This one is trying to access a deer that has a deer carcass that has been covered with snow. So if you find a deer carcass, by all means, put up a camera. This is in Southern California, very different habitat than you have in Long Island, but just to drive home the point, edges and ledges, okay? Shrubby, rocky areas is where I've gotten all my gray foxes. This one actually has, I think, a little ground squirrel in its mouth here, but many, many captures here. You know, it's a little different situation. They have a higher population density there of foxes, so it's easier to get it, but nonetheless, just making the point, shrubby, rocky areas. I know, like Massachusetts, Long Island is a very wet area, so targeting a puddle usually will not be productive for you, but perhaps in the summer, if you have a droughty period, you could put out a pan of water in your yard or find like a natural puddle somewhere, target that. That can be super productive. This camera is actually targeting a little puddle between the rocks there, and I got many different species coming to it, including these 2 gray foxes. Okay, like the gray fox, the coyote is a carnivore that evolved as a carnivore, but now kind of functions as an omnivore. So it does hunt a lot, more so than the gray fox, but it also eats a lot of fruit and nuts and grain. And it too will leave scats on elevated surfaces, but they really like to punctuate trails with their scat. And particularly they have a particular affinity for trail junctions. And that's exactly what we're on here. This coyote is on a bear trail, and it kind of intersects with another trail that comes from a beaver dam that the animals use as a bridge. So this whole area was a sort of a trail junction, and it had both coyotes and bobcat scats at it. And I got a lot of captures of both of them there. So coyotes really use people trails quite a lot. They'll use deer trails sometimes, so that's an option for you. Once in a while, I get one using a log spanning water as a bridge, but it has to be a really big fat log. They're not going to use little skinny logs like weasels and mink will use. And wherever there's a high density of rabbits, they'll investigate rodent burrows, so perhaps around the groundhog burrows. They scavenge from carcasses. In Massachusetts, coyotes love the apple orchards. They do eat apples quite a lot, and they also like to hunt the other animals that eat fruit apples and the apple twigs. They love the brushy areas around the orchards. They'll kind of hide in there and go coursing through the apple orchards. I don't know how many orchards you have, if that's a common thing in Long Island, but that's where they are here. They will sometimes hunt for the rodents that come and eat spilled seed from bird feeders, but I suspect that since your population of coyotes is so low, they won't relegate themselves to that. They'll be able to better keep their distance from people. And same for chicken coops and compost piles. I'm going to talk a little bit about their rendezvous sites, and you'll understand why when I get to that. Okay, so like the fox, they use that same alternating walk or trot, also called a direct register walk or trot. But in the case of the coyote, it tends to be a much narrower line. You don't have that really noticeable zigzag that we had with the fox. And they also like, if you have a dog, you might recognize this pattern. Coyotes like to use the side trot. This is an example of that. Their tracks are very dog-like, but they're much larger and more oval than the fox tracks we saw before. They tend to be, compared to dog tracks, they tend to be very tight and streamlined, like these examples are pretty tight tracks. They don't usually splay their toes and stick them out to the sides like a lot of dogs do. And these are the claw marks for the 2 leading toes, and they tend to be real close together, like you can see in this particular example. Their scat depends on what they've been eating, and I have 4 examples to show you that variation, but obviously their scats are much bigger than any of the other animals that we've talked about so far. So on the top left, this one's full of fur. That coyote was eating animals, and the scat's all twisted up with that tapered end. So it's like the weasel scat, but ginormous compared to the weasel scat. This one on the upper right is full of feathers. This one on the lower right was found in an apple orchard, and it's full of apple. This one on the lower left was found behind a cornfield, and it's full of corn. They love to hang around agricultural fields, the edges around orchards and cornfields. So here's a capture I got of a coyote using this huge log as a bridge. Like I said, I don't get them that often there. You need a real big log. They're not into log walking as much as some of the other animals. It's a possibility. This is actually in Arizona at a prairie dog town. I know you don't have prairie dogs there, obviously, but again, I'm making the point of high density of prey attracts the predators. So I was actually more interested in the prairie dogs, but I got tons of predators, including coyotes, coursing through the prairie dog town looking for dinner. So again, for you, rabbits, woodchucks, chipmunks, rats, mice, and voles, wherever there are lots of any of them, you have a good chance of getting coyotes and other predators. And they will scavenge. These ones are trying to access that same deer carcass that the gray fox was at. I'm going to tell you about rendezvous sites. Well, maybe you'll understand when I get to that. Let me explain what they are. So coyotes have their pups in the springtime, and after in a den underground typically. And when the pups are a couple of months old, they're too big for the den, but they're too little to go hunting with the parents. So the parents find a safe above ground home site that they call, in the case of coyotes, they call it a rendezvous site, where the adults can leave the pups when they go hunting, and then they'll come back and hang out with them and feed them. And they are very specific about the kind of places that they choose for rendezvous sites. And I have put my cameras at several places that meet these criteria. In no case was I actually trying to target coyotes, but they show up all the time at these kinds of spaces. I think that the parents just tend to look for these places as good rendezvous sites for in the future, planning for when they have their pups. They really like these sorts of places, and some of them were just sort of coincidentally eventually used as rendezvous sites with, my camera just hanging out there. So what they like is they want an open area where the pups can play. So this is a big rock outcrop. And they like adjacent dense cover, which we have in the back there. And they wanted to have a good view so the parents can be on the lookout for danger. So here we have the pups playing in the foreground, and this parent way in the back here is just keeping watch for danger. And they also like it to be near water, and this rock outcrop overlooks a lake. So this was sort of perfect for that. I did not put the camera there intending to get them. They just came and used it. Same exact thing happened here. This one was in Maine. Rock outcrop overlooks this huge wetland, lots of dense cover around it that's out of the camera's field of view. They used it as a rendezvous site, got lots of cool footage of the pups here. These are the two pups playing. And same thing here. I did not put my camera here intending to get coyotes, but I put it there for other reasons. But rock outcrop, dense cover around it, overlooking a huge wetland that was to the right of the camera's field of view, and tons of coyote activity. And they also use this as a rendezvous site. And I'll show you just a really cool clip from a longer video. This is that same, this area here is what we're at in this video. And what we're going to see is this parent. You'll look carefully at the parent as it walks in. It has a really distended belly. That's because it just gorged on food, and it's going to regurgitate food for a begging pup. Here comes the pup begging. So there you go. So I know that you have very few coyotes on Long Island, but I've just personally found these types of spots to be so attractive to coyotes that I would try. Like, if you know of any spots or you can find any spots like this, it would be worth a try, because if you have mated pairs, they're probably going to be scoping out these kinds of spots for future use. Okay, the last species we're going to talk about is the southern flying squirrel. So this is primarily an herbivore that eats mostly acorns, nuts, and seeds, but also berries, flowers, buds, insects, and some bird eggs. They'll raid bird nests the way chipmunks do. They live in tree cavities, and just knowing, you don't have to know a lot about them to target them, just knowing what they eat and where they den, you know that they're going to like mature forest with lots of oak and hickory trees, right? And with some big old trees that have cavities in them so they can den. That's what they need. And your backyard is good enough if it has oak trees or hickory trees and some big old trees with cavities. You may have flying squirrels there. So for camera placement, cavity-ridden trees with telltale scat piles at the base, which I'll show you examples of. So we'll get to that. They come to bird feeders. So if you have a bird feeder in the backyard, you can try targeting that, particularly if you have oak trees or hickory trees in or near your yard and you have a bird feeder up. I think there's a pretty good chance, if your population of flying squirrels is decent there, you have a pretty good chance of attracting it. They'll also use nest boxes, the bluebird type nest boxes with a 1.5-inch entry hole. And they will move into those if it's if it's in the middle of the field, like people put them for bluebirds, but if they're like in the forest or near the forest edge, they will use them. And they might, you can tell a rodent's in there because they'll gnaw around the entry hole of the nest box. I'm not going to get into the tracks. They are distinctive, but you really need to know what the other rodent tracks look like, the gray squirrel tracks look like, in order to tell the difference between flying squirrel and other rodent tracks. So we're going to spend too much time. People who are interested can seek that out. So this was what I was talking about before. They gnaw around the cavity openings, or if it's a birdhouse, they'll gnaw around the entry hole of the birdhouse. But this is non-specific. Other rodents do that too. So you see this, you think it could be a flying squirrel, not necessarily. What is diagnostic is the huge scat piles they create. Here's scats spilling out of a cavity, and here's a huge collection of flying squirrel scat spilling out of a tree. And here's an even bigger collection. The lighting is really bad, so it's hard to see, but this pile that I'm circling here with my cursor, that's all flying squirrel scat at the base of this hemlock tree, which had cavities higher up. This would be, if you are interested in targeting flying squirrels, it would be really helpful to learn to identify the scat pellets. You get a sense of the size. There's my ruler, there's a penny. They are they're sort of rectangular in shape and slightly flattened. I try to show that in this photo, but it's really kind of hard to see that the pellets are slightly flattened. Maybe you can see that down here on the left, slightly flattened pellet. So if you see these pellets spilling out like this, they're the only animal that does that. There's no other rodent where you're going to find a huge collection of scat pellets like that. So if you find that, that's probably documentation right there that you have a flying squirrel, but it would be great to get it on trail camera. And so what you could do is I would look for those scat piles. If you have them there, you will find those. I find those fairly frequently. If you have flying squirrels there, you will find the scat piles. I find them fairly frequently. And what you could do is when you find one of those, you know there are flying squirrels there, you can put a handful of hickory nuts or acorns either into the cavity, if it's at a good height in the tree for you to target it with your camera, or you could put it like on a low branch if you're able to do that, or right at the base of the tree. I wouldn't just put piles of acorns or hickory nuts in random places hoping to get flying squirrels, because mice and gray squirrels are probably much more numerous and they'll get them first. In fact, if it's in your yard, I would put it out. This was in my yard. I put these out like just as night falls, so that the flying squirrels don't have to compete with the gray squirrels, which they're so used to people that they'll come out as soon as I go in the house, they'll come out and take all the nuts. So wait till they go to bed. Flying squirrels are nocturnal and they only have to compete with the mice to get the nuts. Another telltale sign is flying squirrels create a particular kind of feeding sign on hickory nuts. This on the left was eaten by a flying squirrel, and you notice that the hole is super regular round, very smooth round hole. Here's one on the right, the photo on the right. One is very smooth and round, that was eaten by a flying squirrel. This is a very irregular hole eaten by a mouse. The other rodents do not create these really smooth round holes that the flying squirrels are. They're more jaggedy. Okay, so if you find that you think you got flying squirrels in the area, look around for a good place to target it. Look for the scat pile spilling out of the tree. Here's what it looks like, not very impressive on the on a IR flash at night. Here's one with a white flash camera. I just targeted this huge old hemlock tree that was full of cavities, and I still have a camera there. I get flying squirrels there pretty frequently. There's one here. I didn't put any nuts there or anything. They just live in there. Actually, I didn't even put the camera there for the purpose of flying squirrels. I put it there because there's a porcupine den in here. But anyway, big old cavity trees, good places to look. Okay, so I'm going to say a few words about lures and baits, not too much because frankly, I don't have a lot of experience with this. It's not that useful to me, but I think doing a presence absence survey, it could be very useful to you because you want to document as many species as possible. So for baiting, that's, just putting food out. You want to make sure you know what your target species eats, right? So you're not going to put apples out for weasels, just know what they eat. We've already talked about bird feeders several times. I mentioned them. They can be very attractive to a variety of species, and that's a form of baiting right there. So a lure is an inedible attractant. There are sound lures, there are visual lures, but when people are trying to attract mammals, which have amazing senses of smell, they usually use scent lures because these animals are very curious about any new smell in their environment. They go check it out. Some people go with something something that they have around, like some kind of perfume or cologne, oil of peppermint, very strong smelling. Animals will be curious about it and come sniff. Or you can go online and buy scent lures that are made for fur trappers, and they are, marketed as if they're really specific, and they might be highly attractive to a certain species. But if you have a very low population density of that species, you still, there's still a long shot in getting it. For example, coyote attractant. If you only have, a few coyotes on Long Island, the chances are going to be slim. In my limited experience with these, I don't necessarily get the target species, but I get a lot of other animals coming in to smell it. Like I put out, I think it was Fisher and Martin lure once, and I got deer and raccoons and squirrels and so forth. So lots of animals will check them out, which is, good for you because you want to document as many species as possible. So that's it here. If you want to learn how to guide your camera placement by tracking and learning about animal behavior, please feel free to check out my book. And if you want to find me online, feel free to subscribe to our blog. Both my husband and I post on that. We have a Facebook page called Winterberry Wildlife Cams. My personal YouTube channel has all our wildlife videos on it. And then we have a Facebook group if you want to post your own material called Trail Camera Photos and Videos. So at this point, I'd be happy to take questions. Are there any questions?
Awesome. Thank you, Janet. I put the website and blog into the chat. I also just signed up, so I'm very excited to get some some emails from you. Just looking quickly, I know, Mike, you were able to answer some questions in the chat.
Yeah, there's one here that specifically asks, so it's Marie Nealon. Do flying squirrels also eat black walnuts?
Yes, yeah.
I do think they really relish a lot of fungi, mushrooms and things like that as well.
They do, but I think nuts are, more calorie dense for them. And I think fungi and lichens are more appealing to the northern flying squirrel than the southern. The southern has the option of eating lots of nuts because we have oak hickory forests. So I think that's going to be their primary food source. And if you're, to attract them, I would use the nuts or sunflower seeds even. I think that would be
Right.
very attractive.
Okay, there's another question about what is the distance from the camera in which a triggering will occur? You know,
Okay, so yeah, the detection range, I didn't talk about that. I do, sometimes I do, but I didn't have time in this one, so I did not include that. But it depends on the camera and it depends on the size of the animal. So one camera might say it has a detection range of 50 feet, saying, indicating that it will detect an animal 50 feet away from it. But remember that these cameras are mainly marketed for hunters. So when they say a detection range of 50 feet, they mean of a big animal like a deer. You're not going to get a weasel 50 feet away. Okay. If it says the detection range is 50 feet, it might get a moose at 75 feet. You know, it really depends on the size of the animal, because the bigger the animal, the bigger the signal it creates. Yeah, I mean, that's
okay. So related to that, if you're trying to set up a camera angled at the tree cavity, I assume this is for the flying squirrel.
yeah.
Would you set the camera up on the ground, or should you rig something up higher to the tree?
It depends on what you're targeting. So if you're targeting a cavity that's up higher, you have to have your camera up higher. But if the cavities are too high, but you know that if you found the scat pile and you know there are flying squirrels there, I would just put a pile of acorns or hickory nuts or sunflower seeds at the base of the tree near the scat pile, or if there's a lower branch, and target that. You know, target wherever you put the food. Yeah, I mean, if you're able to target a cavity, do it, but usually they're too high up.
Right. Okay. And then let's see, Kevin Walsh, who's a pretty ace trail camera guy for our crew here on Long Island. Do you have any tips, suggestions for targeting skunks?
No, I didn't. I actually have very little experience camera trapping skunks, and the reason is that where I live, they're mostly in the suburbs, and I don't put my cameras in the suburbs. They'll come, well, compost piles maybe. Okay, you might get them there. I don't see them. I try to keep them in wilder areas, and I hardly ever get skunks in wild areas. They're around houses here, so they might go under your shed, or under your porch or something, or visit your compost pile. Come to a bird feeder. If you find those little, so I don't have a picture of this to show you, but they do like forage for insects in lawns, and they make these kind of small conical digs all over lawns. And if you find that, you probably have a skunk, so you could just put it out in your yard.
Okay, so Kevin, can you unmute yourself and describe the conical digs that you found in the Pine Barrens?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The digs were in sandy soil, very small. They got narrower as they got deeper. Only maybe an inch or two deep, but there's numerous holes of that size, and you could tell that the nose of the skunk was being pushed down into the soil, in addition to it digging with its front paws and claws.
Right. So Kevin, what was roughly how many holes were in, say, a square yard, 3 by 3 foot area?
3 to 5.
Yeah. Okay.
Could be that many. But there was hundreds of the holes over the course of a few acres, a couple acres.
Right.
Within an acre, there was hundreds of holes.
And this was plain sand, or was there any vegetation there?
It was Pine Barrens habitat.
Oh.
Lots of short, stunted pitch pine trees.
Yeah.
And but very little vegetation growing on the ground.
but as I recall, it wasn't bare sand. It was actually, needle covered.
Well, yeah, because there's, it is the Pine Barrens, so there is some shedding of pine needles and things. But I did set up a camera and I successfully got the skunks at that
Oh,
site.
you did? Oh, cool.
Yes. And verified what was making those diggings in those
Yeah.
holes. But they're pretty rare. I mean, pretty rare. They're extremely rare on Long Island. And, we have mostly suburban developed habitat here, but I don't see them at all in the suburban environment. The only places I've picked up any signs of them have been the undeveloped, relatively wild parcels of land left on the land.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, we have been getting on the iNaturalist site that we're using. We've been getting a lot of photos and photos of skunks, surprisingly, in Nassau County and even into I believe it's a cemetery in Brooklyn or Queens.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's been a kind of a surprise, how many photos we've been getting, and the range of their distribution on Long Island has been surprising. So Callie Vilmakos, another great tracker here on Long Island, had a question about, to Kevin's point, what time of the year did you notice the digs?
I've seen the digging in the fall, September, October, before the ground kind of hardens up from the cold temperatures. And I've seen it in late spring, early summer, June, early June.
Yeah,
Those-
Mike, this Tim, their digs, they're typically going after grubs in the ground, so beetle grubs and stuff. So you'll get them from the spring through the fall, like Kevin says.
Okay.
And if you get sandy soil, you may get tracks. They're very, very small, petite tracks.
Okay, so let's see, just a few comments about the skunks. They're expanding east on the North Fork. A colleague of mine, Steve Biasetti, has been sort of keeping a journal of their progress from the Manorville Hills area, extending out towards the North Fork. It's kind of interesting. And let's see. Any tips on getting, so Anita writes, asking about how to get a photo of a possum. She has an opossum under her deck from time to time. So I would think, if she has a compost pile, that'd be a good place to get a photo
Absolutely.
at night. They're probably
Yeah.
visiting some food source in the yard.
Yeah, they love compost. We've had 3 possums at a time at our compost.
Yeah.
They love those areas.
And yeah, nothing else so far, but a lot of thank yous to you, Janet, for a great presentation.
Welcome. It was fun. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So I guess that's it. So this will be recorded, as I said earlier, and we'll have this posted on the CTUC website. So if you know anyone that couldn't make it tonight, spread the word, and we'll have this up, within a couple days.
Cool.
We'll send out an email to everybody that registered about that.
Okay.
And thanks for everyone's interest, and look forward to working with you all on this 3-year project. It's kind of an exciting project. And I want to shout out to Matt Schlesinger, who was here earlier. I don't know if he's still here, but he was very instrumental in getting this rolling for the Long Island region. And really appreciate that. A busy guy. So that was great.
All right.
And thanks, Ariel, for hosting.
Mike,
Of course.
any suggestions on where to put a trail cam to catch the gray wolves?
We don't have gray wolves on Long Island.
Or what did you say before in Yaphank?
A gray fox.
Yeah, gray fox.
No, I really don't have any suggestions for that,
Okay.
but
Janet did.
Yeah, I mean, we had a section on that. Yeah. Did you have?
that's a tricky animal. I mean, has a very limited, it seems it has a very limited distribution on Long Island. And Luke Ormond, who works for Brookhaven Town, is a wildlife biologist. He's been trying to pin down and get photos of one of the last sightings, which was in the Yaphank area. And
Okay.
he's been at that for, I think 2 years now, but we haven't gotten anything. And Tim Green has also,
I know Tim.
he has photos of gray foxes near Brookhaven National Lab, but not any recent photos.
Okay.
So one thing that is unique to Long Island, I think, kind of unique to Long Island, is we have a lot of roadkills, and it might be worth, in some cases, dragging a deer over to a secluded spot, and seeing what you can attract in that Yaphank Central Pine Barrens area for attracting a gray fox.
Do you need a permit on Long Island to move roadkill? Because I know you do in some states.
Deer, that's a good question. I'll have to check that out. It's possible.
I've moved deer before. I don't know if you need a.
Doesn't mean it's legal.
permit.
It doesn't mean, right, it doesn't mean it's legal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to
Lots
ask
of
around about that. Tim, what do you think about that? Are you still on?
Yeah, you probably can, as long as you're not, you're not using it for consumption, your personal consumption and stuff.
Yeah, I'll check with Leslie Lupo on
It'd
that.
probably be best if we check with Leslie,
Okay,
just to be careful.
right. But on the other hand, I mean, it's very common to run across a deer kill. I mean, I just ran into one the other day, a dead deer in the woods when I was doing the
wow.
otter survey. It was in Riverhead. It was a stone's throw from Route 58, which is the mall area. And yeah, could have set a camera up there. Would have been easy to.
Yeah, that's a bonanza if you find that would be the place. If you have a lot of deer.
Very easy to find deer kills,
Yeah.
especially out in the East End.
Well, there you go.
But even in Nassau County, I have some colleagues that have set up cameras on deer kills and gotten some really cool stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if that's it, thank you, everyone, and we'll be in touch.
All right. Thank you and good luck with your survey.
All right, take
Thank
care.
you.